So hierarchy doesn't go away with the interactive dance, but the kind of hierarchy that Lewis and Milton and Spencer and, throughout the ages, I would say it's, biblical. It is not what we think of as hierarchy. We think of hierarchy as a rigid top-down tyranny. And that, as Milton demonstrated in Paradise Lost, that's satanic hierarchy. So when Miltonists talk about hierarchy, they talk about the hierarchy as it ought to be, as we see demonstrated by the Son, the angels, Adam and Eve before and when they repent. It is fluid. Christ, the Son of God, becomes one of us to die. Fluid hierarchy. And so the ideal hierarchy that English writers have worked with throughout the ages is this kind of fluid hierarchy. So to be a true king is to be the servant of all, and you do it out of an atmosphere of love.
Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holser. I am Derek Holser. Sure enough, The Plunge is a lot like that crisp fall day, and you have just gotten yourself a convertible. Maybe you rented a Sportster on Turo, no sponsorship provided, and you're out on a winding, curvy road, and the autumn leaves are a smattering of green and orange and yellow and red, and there's nothing like it. The cool breeze in your hair and the bright sun overhead. You feel like you could do anything, and you kind of want to. But then you realize you got to return the car later that night, and you only paid for basic insurance coverage, so you're not going to do anything too risky. But with The Plunge, it's like being in a souped-up Ferrari that you own, and you have the entire road to yourself for miles and miles and miles, and everything is cushioned all around you, so you can just go at breakneck speed and survive any kind of tumble or twist. Yeah, that's The Plunge. Dive in. Today's episode of The Plunge features a conversation with Monika B. Hilder, author, professor, and speaker who specializes in fantasy and children's literature, with a particular focus on C.S. Lewis and other Inklings-related writers. She's a professor of English at Trinity Western University and co-founder and co-director of the Inklings Institute of Canada. She's a first Canadian-born member of her family, and as such, she explores the meaning of homeland, the plight of the refugee, and the identity, in short, the importance of story. And in her own work, she has written a fiction book, Letters to Annie, A Grandmother Dreams of Fairy Tale Princesses, Princess, and Happily Ever After. She's also written a trilogy of books regarding C.S. Lewis and femininity. And now, to the question, C.S. Lewis's heroic paradigms, sexist or not? Monika Hilder. I am thrilled today to have with us Monika Hilder, and we are going to be covering the topic, Lewis's heroic paradigms, sexist or not. Fascinating and provocative title. So, Monika, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Derek. It's an honor to be part of this project. Yeah, thank you for that very kind introduction.
My pleasure. As I've mentioned before, this is a series of conversations that we are having regarding C.S. Lewis, but a little bit more emphasis on George MacDonald, who is a bit unknown, but is actually someone that C.S. Lewis pointed to as a tremendous influence in his life. And so before we get into George, though, because of your deep knowledge and expertise, I'd love to hear if you'd be willing to share the origins of your personal interest and passion for the works of C.S. Lewis and your subsequent co-founding of the Inklings Institute of Canada. And maybe for some of our attendees, they might not even know who the Inklings were. Maybe share a little bit about that.
Okay, yeah. So my interest in C.S. Lewis, well, I first found out about C.S. Lewis when I was a teenager. I started with reading Mere Christianity, and I thought, wow, this is fantastic. This is like a confirmation, like catechism, but better, like better explanations. And it wasn't until I was actually a few years later, I'm trying to remember when, but it's certainly by my early 20s, I found out about Narnia, and thought, well, this is fantastic because he really combines the fairy tale genre, which I so love, and the Bible, and it's all there. I was a child, I grew up on the Bible, and typically Grimm's fairy tales, German fairy tales. As a kid, I knew that both were true in different ways. And so this idea of using the fairy tale fantasy genre in order to point to God, to experience God, I mean, that was totally me. And I do think it has something to do, as I was reflecting on this question a little bit, I was reflecting on this a little bit and thought, well, if I'm going to try to analyze it, I think it does have something to do with my family having been refugees for a time and being the firstborn Canadian myself, the idea of the quest for homeland. So when you've kind of lost everything, not your life, and not even your family, thank God, but what is home and so on and so on. And obviously, as a Christian, we do have this sense of homeland as being in the heart of God, and we're all pilgrims. So that just totally made sense to me. In terms of how I got to professoring and being asked to, that was one of my very wonderful colleagues who said, Monika, you and your other colleague, Stephen Dunning, you should start the Inklings Institute. And I thought, what a brilliant idea. Yes, of course we should. But yeah, so my own education outside the church has all been public university, public high school and everything. So I'm really used to people don't know or are critical and so on, like how to speak to people who either may not know anything, think they know, and are very hostile to, or just confused about Christianity. Anyway, as an undergrad, Lewis was really the one who kind of helped me to think and write. Like, how do I speak to my professors? I mean, a lot of them were absolutely brilliant and open and all that, but a lot of them were like, this is, so how do I convey, my Christian worldview in ways that make sense? So that's sort of part of my journey. And in terms of the Inklings Institute, well, it's the Inklings Institute of Canada, and we have national and international membership, and it's just so exciting to have events on campus where we, obviously students, faculty, but the general public, we come to really celebrate and to learn from what these earlier writers have thought. So the Inklings, who are the Inklings? Well, strictly speaking, we have four friends, colleagues of friends who met together in Evelyn Child Club or in Lewis's rooms at Magdalen College, Oxford, and they talked about literature, and in particular, they read each other's drafts to one another. So a little bit daunting, if you don't like what Tolkien wrote and he doesn't like what you wrote. So who are they? So it's C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, Owen Barfield, who is lesser known, very brilliant, very important, and Charles Williams. So those are the four main ones. There are, of course, many other Inklings, friends connected, Lewis's brother as well. And then typically we connect their mentors, who are G.K. Chesterton and George MacDonald. So they're really like the pillars who greatly influenced the others. And then we definitely want to include their friend, Dorothy Sayers. Mm-hmm. So there are like 7 really big names, and then there are many others, and there's always more to discover. So, yeah.
Oh, wonderful. And as an aside, you mentioned membership in the Institute, and you said international. So any of the Americans participating in this series, if they're curious, could log on and find out more, I assume?
Yes, we have American membership. And so we have academics around the world who are members. We have, if I could brag about our publication, the Inklings and Culture. It's right behind me. I could pull it out. But anyway, so we had something like, 27 chapters. So Inklings members around the globe who have contributed. And then we have a completely open membership, anyone who wants to find out about us. And also, especially, now that we've all learned how to do Zoom, we tend to have, hybrid meetings. So if people want to listen in and, converse with us as we are, have events on campus, that's all very lovely.
Wonderful. Well, I will certainly add that to the course resources so they can explore that, and I'll explore it for myself. And thank you for illuminating a little bit about how the Inklings worked and your own passion and how pivotal Lewis was in helping you communicate. That's really, really inspiring. As we turn to one of Lewis's greatest influences, George MacDonald, I was reading on your website, the more you read of this Scotsman, you wrote, such a pleasure, the more you realize that Lewis wasn't exaggerating when he said he's always quoting MacDonald. What elements of MacDonald's storytelling stand out in your examination to lead Lewis to make such a proclamation? I mean, that's a bold statement by C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, it's especially bold because at the same time, he said that, George MacDonald's fiction is maybe not always the best or something, but, and people quibble about that. It's like, no, George MacDonald was better than that. But the big thing for Lewis was the idea of imagination. And both of them really highly respected and were informed also by William Wordsworth, who said that in his prelude, that imagination is reason exalted. So typically,
Wow.
I know, right? And it has to do with intuitive reason. So Milton in Paradise Lost, the angels have intuitive reason, like they just know, Whereas we maybe once in a while have that aha moment. Some people think it typically happens in math. Wherever it happens, the aha moment. So we might, yeah. And so typically we have to work at it. We need to use discursive reason. And of course, we pray for the insight. So what Lewis really loved about MacDonald, well, there's so much mythic wonder. So really being open to fantasy, mythic stories that point to the eternal. So quite a few things to say about that. His collection, actually, this is something, I've got it right here. I can hold it up. Anyway, yeah. So Lewis, again, he felt that, MacDonald is so important. He so wished that people would know about MacDonald. And so he put together this collection of, some of his favorite quotes. And a couple of things still stand out for me in that. I think I've already mentioned the childlike wonder, that you have to have that childlike openness. Imagination, of course, which is not contrary to reason. It is more like right reason, like ethical reason, moral reason. And the fiction was very important to Lewis that MacDonald wrote, but also his unspoken sermons. He was a minister, he wrote a lot of sermons, he also gave some, but he mainly became a novelist. So the theology is really important. And Lewis saying that, there's really no one that he knew that was closer to the Spirit of Christ than MacDonald. Doesn't mean MacDonald was perfect. Some people think of him as heterodox, and there is some discussion around that. But another thing that stands out for me that is, I think, really evident in Lewis's own spiritual journey and in how he wrote, and that was MacDonald's concept of inexorable love. So love is such that, MacDonald said, God's love is such that it would be experienced as either heaven or hell, depending on where you're at. And so, for example, we see that in the dwarves at the end of the last battle, like, they think they're in this foul stable, and that's where they are in their, they're entrapped. So this idea that God refines us and continues to refine us, and is it painful? Well, yeah, but it's life. It's life.
Yes. And it's his love, as MacDonald styles it, at the core of that fire that is purifying our hearts and our imaginations. And thank you. That's a wonderful journey through the connections between the two. And so we have these guys who are quite prominent in their own right. MacDonald in his time, I think, arguably as prominent as Lewis may have been in his era. He was certainly known in the Western world and spoke broadly and had hundreds of thousands of copies of his novels sold. But both of them, and I'm drawing here from a beautiful talk you gave entitled Is the Bible Anti-Woman? And I'll also include the YouTube link for the course resources for those who want to go and hear this eloquent discourse by Monika. But my next question regarding that idea is, could you share a character or a scene from Lewis's fiction that demonstrates your belief, as you said, that Lewis was far less sexist than many of us are today?
Yeah, that's where to start? There are so many. It's everywhere. I even see it before Lewis became a believer. But anyway, what I will say, it's hard to pick a favorite novel, but I tend to say I really love That Hideous Strength. And it's because I love Jane Studdock. And she's totally the most controversial character in all of Lewis's work. And so Jane is the character who receives these dream visions. She's a visionary, and she thinks she's going crazy because she's a modernist. She doesn't understand that God actually speaks in dreams, you know. And then when she finds out that she's actually has visions of what is happening and sometimes before it's happened. Anyway, so the thing with Jane is that she receives, right? So thank you, Freud. It's a psychosexual image, right? To be receptive. And as you know, our grand image of the feminine receiving God is, of course, the mother of God, Mary saying, yes, yes, I will do this. And so Lewis has this female character who is receptive. But the thing that I think we really get tripped up on in our time is that although ironically, we think we're so sophisticated, so much smarter than people in the past, but we actually are, I think, more literal minded. So when we think masculine, feminine, we're incredibly literal. But over the centuries, people have been very good with metaphor. That was not to say they were androgynous. But so when people spoke about the feminine, like Wordsworth, he said to be an ethical human being, you must have that female softness. Everyone knew what that meant. Nietzsche knew what it meant. That's why he said he hated Christianity, because it's so feminine. So back to Jane, she's receiving, and gradually, she also becomes a Christian. That is a struggle for her. And the thing of course, that we see in that novel, in That Hideous Strength, is that she's a great example of receiving, but so are the guys, right? So Merlin, the big, massive, he's literally massive, realizes that his physical strength, his intellectual strength is not going to win the battle. He must receive, and he's absolutely terrified to do that, and he does. And of course, Ransom and all the others. Yeah, so Jane, I think, is a brilliant example of that.
And of that reflection, I guess, of the Spirit of Christ in terms of the yielding power, as it were. Is that a good way of maybe tying a bow on that?
Yes, Derek, I think you've nailed it, because we have that constant struggle, the I, the egotism, so our egotistical power to yield our ego to God. And that's, whatever power is valuable, it's the Holy Spirit. So it's only through that we can do that. Yeah.
And I apologize. I kind of cherry picked from that talk just because it's so nicely tied in with what I wanted to have you share with this series, as I try to pick little facets of, I guess, in my estimation, MacDonald and Lewis in their own way were both subversive and orthodox in the most beautiful sense of the word. Maybe this is Chesterton's voice to me, but I feel in some ways in our times, true orthodoxy is highly subversive. So anyway, I'm taking another quote from you, so do with it what you will. But you made the statement in the talk that we are all chauvinists. And I thought this was a fantastic statement, which you elucidated with precision in your presentation, of these kind of two Western heroic concepts or paradigms. And so I'm curious if you would help us understand, how would you say we are all chauvinist, and how this has informed our attitude and action in our contemporary living?
Yes, thank you so much. So it goes back, for my own journey with that, it goes back to having spent a lot of time with studying Milton and just kind of thinking about the two Western heroic paradigms. I think they're actually global, but I'm only qualified to speak about the Western. And so it is really obvious in Paradise Lost that the satanic figure is a hero. He embodies all of the Greco-Roman qualities. So qualities such as pride, such as conquest, and of course in the satanic figure, hatred. These are all virtues. It's like, really? Yes. So before I talk about gender, so I'm looking at, the satanic heroism. So Milton has taken all the classical qualities, and this is the satanic hero. And then we have the biblical, we could call it the spiritual, but based in biblical ethos, those heroic qualities, which are typically, they're in opposition. So instead of satanic pride, we have Christ-like humility. Instead of conquest, we have, well, of course, the ultimate sacrifice, the passion of Christ. And in terms of, the human community and the entire heavenly body community, we have not this individualism conquest, we have interdependence, we have community. And there are several other qualities, of course, that we could talk about. Well, we talked about receptivity earlier. So is that biblical quality that we would receive. The satanic hero does not receive. Okay, so then, I ask my students, so which qualities have been associated with gender? And it's like, it takes them less than a moment. And they say, well, obviously, we have associated classical heroic qualities with the masculine. And the classical hero always disparages the biblical, right? And since we're all sinful human beings, I could say honestly, unfortunately, but it's good to confess, right? That I wake up as a classical hero every morning and then find out by the grace of God, yeah, Monika, it's not working. You knew this, right? So we're all chauvinists. It's very easy to say that one gender is chauvinist. Well, no, we have these paradigms in competition. And so when we look at Jane Studdock, who is receiving dreams, and I didn't touch on the point that's so controversial, is that she decides to become an obedient wife and future mother. It looks like she's giving up her PhD to do that, but that's not totally clear. But anyway, there's a lot of conversation around that. So we coming from a chauvinist perspective, then we look at Jane and say, well, how dumb is that? And we totally miss the point that she's actually a spiritual leader. It's her husband who's really quite spiritually dumb. He learns from her. It doesn't have to be, he just was spiritually dumb. Her kind of obedience is not what we think of, because if we're thinking from a satanic, classical, heroic paradigm, then we have sort of wrongful ideas. Does that help?
That does. Well, and I love that that you classify all of us in that category, because part of the dynamic of, say, the last 50 years has been a rise in what we have termed feminism, and that means a lot to a lot of different people. But as I think I've received it from the culture, the concept is, a woman can't be a chauvinist because she's a woman, right?
That's so funny. This is the reality. You're absolutely right.
Right. And I'm inherently a chauvinist because of my male gender, right? So a fascinating twist, because you brought it down to the very granular level for yourself. Every morning when you wake up, you have to cede that will of the classic hero that resides in our nature, right? So that's excellent. I really appreciate that. And I'm hopeful. I was looking around on my shelf, but my copy of That Hideous Strength is actually sort of an old one, and it's somewhere in another more
I got it.
protected area.
Well, excuse me. I'm just going to grab it because I love the cover. You want to see it?
Sure.
This is the one that I work with.
Okay. Yes.
That one.
Yes,
I've got another one too. I have an American edition, which is different, because this is the fuller edition. Anyway.
Well, I knew this was going to happen. Every conversation that I have, there's so much. We're not even scratching the surface. We're like flying over it rapidly and hoping to catch a peak. But the desire for this series again is just to awaken a curiosity in the hearts of the attendees that the words and the ideas that have been expressed by these thinkers are very profound and are as applicable today as ever, because they're true. And truth is always timeless. Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word elucidate. 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 Elucidate means to make clear, especially by explanation or analysis. To give a clarifying explanation. You know, there's a lot of things that we'd all like to have elucidated in our life. For now, just try to elucidate what's deepest in your own heart before you grapple with what's in your neighbor's. Just my 2 cents. Hey, thank you, Elucidate, for sponsoring this episode of The Plunge. Next question I have for you is, how would you say I know this is kind of a vague question. It's not given much direction, so do with it what you will. But how would you say MacDonald and Lewis demonstrate a proper Christian portrayal of the heroic in their fiction?
Yes, they are both so concerned about having proper humility. And I think that we see this really being obedient to God and how difficult that is for us, and how it's the only thing that is the only attitude that we can have in order to have life in all its fullness. So maybe you could just repeat the question. I'm trying to see. I think that's something else I wanted to say about that.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just if there's any, and you already mentioned that hideous strength and Jane's character,
Yeah.
but anything that you might say, maybe more for MacDonald, but both of them, how they demonstrate that Christian heroic concept as opposed to the Western heroic concept in their stories.
Right. So one of the things that I think about is how they both resisted what we call progressivism, which is not progress, it's all about regress. But in terms of so they're both pushing against rejecting a philosophical naturalism, that all that there is what we can measure empirically, the atheistic perspective. So, for example, both writers are really worried about how our tendency since the 19th century on, it was actually earlier, but it really became obvious maybe in the 19th century, this worship of science from an amoral perspective. So they're really worried about what we then call, and Lewis, calls scientism. So, for example, MacDonald's novel, Thomas Wingfold Curate, you've got this one character in there, George Bascom, who is just, oh man, I mean, he sees someone who is somehow physically challenged, we might say, and he says, yeah, those people don't have a right to live. So he's totally this kind of eugenics guy. Mm-hmm. And we have the same characterization in the big drama of what scientism looks like as a lived experience in that hideous strength, because of course we've got this scientist conspiracy wanting to take over the world. And it was fascinating to me that George Orwell said, well, I don't really like the religious part, but yeah, the scientist conspiracy, totally realizable. Like Lewis really nailed that one. But coming back to this whole idea of childlike wonder, humility, and inexorable love. So you've got, for example, in MacDonald, and that's when I think I really fell in love with MacDonald when I first read. The first book I read was The Princess and the Goblin. I read it in a university children's literature class by a very beloved professor, Margaret Blom. So she introduced me to Princess and the Goblin, and I'm like, oh my goodness, it's fantastic. And so the character, Princess Irene, who is this 8-year-old girl who discovers the divine, right, has a common with Lucy in Narnia, right? So there's and so many characters. I mean, in terms of inexorable love, I mean, Lewis is Till We Have Faces. I mean, Psyche, who's so open to the divine. Arul is the classical hero. She is worse than her father. Mm-hmm. Her father has more, although he's this chauvinist, he is a chauvinist, but Arul, the female, the daughter, she is more chauvinistic than her dad, and she finally discovers that and repents and becomes like Psyche. So in inexorable love, that God's love has to, and you referred to it earlier, is this consuming fire, as MacDonald said, has to burn away all the impurities, because what is essentially hellish in us, right? It will kill us. God loves us so much, he's got to burn it away.
Beautiful. Sorry, I'm genuinely moved because I'm reflect. First of all, I hadn't really contemplated the similarities of Irene and Lucy, and then as you're elucidating, Till We Have Faces, in my heart, I am struck by, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because I'm definitely not an expert, but it strikes me that Lucy of everyone is the one that is most drawn and driven to forgive Edmund. And am I reading that right? In just sort of the portrayal of this kindness of the little ones?
Yes, I would say you're right about that. I do have to think about it because she's not alone in that. But she
Mm-hmm.
is the one that is, from the start, most sensitive to Aslan. And I think that's very purposeful, the idea that it's the youngest. Now, depending on where one is in one's birth order, we may not like that. I happen to like it because I'm the youngest, you know? But
Yeah.
it's kind of like MacDonald is like, and Lewis, it's like when we're acting like the so-called oldest, and MacDonald has elder characters that are, you know, Christ-like and doing the
Mm-hmm.
right thing. But anyway, it's the idea of independence as opposed to the youngest one knows you don't know, you need help. So Lucy is open. Lucy is not perfect. We see that.
Sure.
But compared to the others, they have to, in a sense, learn from Lucy.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I'm the firstborn of four, so
So,
I have taken my licks and learned humility, hopefully, and I'll keep
well,
working on it.
yeah, and MacDonald has that elder brother character. I'm trying to remember the name of the fairy tale, but he is the Christ figure who helps the
Yeah.
younger ones who can be very bratty.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like we've got about 10 minutes, so I want to
Okay.
touch on a couple more things. This has been a delight, Monica. Thank you so much. For those of us, and presumably everyone on this series is, but there may not be everyone that is. So I want to be open to where everyone is in their journey. But for those who believe the Bible is Holy Scripture intended to guide our lives, how do we reconcile passages that seemingly conflict with equality? And what do you suppose the expression wives ought to obey their husbands means today? How can we contextualize that as a proper understanding of family and societal interaction?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's really an important one, and I think it's much misunderstood because, especially, for example, if you're coming from a context of abuse,
Mm.
or if you're coming from a context where the males in your family, the father, the brother, etc., if they are chauvinists and
Mhm.
think that, you know, a girl's place is, you know, this limit and not, you know, yeah. So it's easy for me to talk about it because I haven't experienced chauvinism with the men in my family. Okay, so I'll just say that right now. I think it would be much more difficult if my father, my brother, my husband, my son would not expect, for example, in my case, intellectual work. They wouldn't expect that. They would say, don't go there. So everyone has always said, go there. And they said, yes. So, okay, the idea of equality before God is absolutely biblical. We are all made in the image of God. We all have equal value and so on. In terms of the fallen world, especially, some people like to parse this out and say, well, it wasn't like that before the fall. I'd have to really think about that theology piece. Anyway, the piece we have now in the fall is that wives are to obey their husbands. Yeah. But what we misunderstand is that the husband is to essentially wear the crown of thorns, to be crucified for his wife and family. Now, what man is going to sign up for crucifixion? Okay, that's the man that the way, you know, is to obey.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, if we think of it, you know, any kind of, you know, worldly normal sociological context, I mean, someone has to call the shots and take that final responsibility. And when they mess up really badly, and everyone knows it. So you've got the captain of the ship, the co-pilot in this case, yeah, the wife is just as important. And the wife, well, if the wife is doing her job, like, she's not supposed to idolize her husband who's a sinner, right? She's supposed to say, you know what, dear, here you go again. That's really not good. And by the way, you see that rock over there? You know, so it's that kind of thing. And it's an ongoing challenge because we're all sinners. But yeah, I don't think we
Yeah.
can take parts of scripture and say, oh well, that doesn't apply today. We are so much smarter. Yeah, no, I mean, we'll find out we're wrong. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I think you covered the next question. So I'm going to jump to a beautiful statement that you made, and I think it's a wonderful summation of all of this, because that equality, that union, is in its purest sense when it's in the will of the Father, in the kingdom of heaven. It is a reflection of our triune God. And you made this statement: God's fluid hierarchy is an interactive dance shared, not a competition. For Lewis, competition is a hellish idea. The heavenly idea is a dance of love and joy. This is a glorious declaration and may seem to be an unrealistic aspiration. So is it realistic, and can we inhabit such a posture in our day-to-day lives?
Well, it's the only way forward. It's the music of the cosmos. And so to the extent that we want to be in tune with God, that's what we are aiming at, knowing that we're sinful people who are constantly struggling in terms of the power struggle. So Marx got that part right. It's a power struggle, but there's a lot he didn't get right. The idea of hierarchy. So hierarchy doesn't go away with the interactive dance, but the kind of hierarchy that Lewis and Milton and Spencer and, throughout the ages, I would say it's, biblical. It is not what we think of as hierarchy, because we, being who we are, and so we think of hierarchy as a rigid top-down tyranny. And that, as Milton demonstrated in Paradise Lost, that's satanic hierarchy. So when Miltonists talk about hierarchy, they talk about, satanic, rigid, top-down tyranny, and the hierarchy as it ought to be, as we see demonstrated by the Son, the angels, Adam and Eve before and when they repent. It is fluid. Christ, the Son of God, becomes one of us to die. Fluid hierarchy. And so the ideal hierarchy that English writers have worked with throughout the ages is this kind of fluid hierarchy. So to be a true king is to be the servant of all, and you do it out of an atmosphere of love, to obey properly, like not slave-like. Paul does use the word slave, but it's not that kind of demeaning thing. Anyway, to obey, it has to do with love. And so lowly are lifted, the high are what? The high bend down. It's like Chesterton saying we're taller when we bow.
Yes. The as you were elucidating that, my thought was the high aren't cut down; they bend down, they stoop down, out of love, in this whole reciprocal dance.
Yes, it is that. It's back and forth. So, for example, in Lewis and Perelandra, at one point, Ransom to that cosmic dance, brilliant chapter, and it's like, I didn't even know if it was me speaking. So it's not even the loss of individuality, but it's these voices interacting. It's probably the best description we have of the interactive dance.
Thank you, Monika. I'm inspired, and I know that everyone listening is as well. Is there anything you'd like to add? And also, in addition to that, if you'd like to share any of your works that you think would be of benefit to people who are more curious about this topic.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, so in terms of books, and I'll think about what I might add. But yes, so I ended up publishing what I thought about C.S. Lewis and gender in 3 volumes. I thought it would be one book, and the publisher said, no, it's too long, but you don't have to cut it in, 3 books. So the feminine ethos on Narnia, the gender dance on the trilogy, and Surprised by the Feminine, everything else, like Tilting Places and the poetry and Scrooge letters and the Great Divorce. Anyway, so that is a very detailed work, which you can get in university libraries and so on. A really short version of that is in Carolyn Curtis and Mary Key Pomray's edition, Women in C.S. Lewis. So I've got a chapter in that. Is Lewis sexist, or is he a seer? And of course, I think he's a prophetic seer, and that we think he's sexist because we are chauvinists and don't get it. So there's that. So I have really loved to work with that. In terms of fiction, you mentioned Letters to Annie. And so that book is one where well, let me just maybe preface it. I was trying to figure out how to convey what I think is happening in classic fairy tale as moral and spiritual truth. And I realized over the now decades of teaching that my university students are finding it harder and harder to read classic fairy tales other than, oh yeah, they're so sexist. Just like, no, don't you remember Shakespeare? You know, virtue is beauty. That's because we're so literalist and so on and so on. So I thought, how can I do this? And the thought came to me, wow, Lewis wrote about prayer, letters to Malcolm. I'm going to write letters to Annie. And it was that quick. It was just like 10 seconds. That's what,
Wow.
So
Yeah.
I wanted to follow through. I wanted to draw upon all these fairy tales that I love and other ones that are, lesser known. And it's all framed through the Inklings and many other writers, including writers that would disagree with me. So I reference them because they're important. The questions people ask are always important. It doesn't mean you have to agree with the answers, but you have to respect everybody, where they're coming from and why and so on. Anyway, so Letters to Annie, quickly said, follows I'm not a grandmother, but I thought I'll take the grandmother voice and follow my fictional granddaughter for the first 25 years of her life. So I love fairy tale. I love princesses. And then, of course, she's taught in school, oh, yeah, no, they're all sexist and so on. Anyway, many of the joys and woes of growing up and how can fairy tales speak to us? And yeah, I mean, men and women of all ages actually have responded really well to that book. So it's not just the female story, it's like everyone's story. So that's an example of what I do with what I've learned from people like Lewis and MacDonald and how they've helped me talk about fairy tale.
Beautiful. Oh man, how fun. Well, I wish we had many more hours to convene and so many things, but thank you so much for your time and for your work, for the years that you've put in to distill these concepts and the generation of students that you've been teaching and those yet to come. So thank you so much, Monika.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Derek, and God bless. All the best.